to talk here. It's really a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to all the input that I will get in the next days. And just a little outline of what I will present to you today. As you heard, I'm working on the philosophy of plants, so I will introduce you to some interesting characterizations of plants, some problems you could call them for our zoocentrically biased philosophy of biology. And then, as you also already heard, I will talk about Agnes Arber, introduce you to her life and work, and also to one of her most important theories, which is called the partial shoot theory of the leaf. And then I will take a step back and talk a bit about Arber's notions of teleology, where I argue that it's in fact two different notions of teleology that she brings forth in her work. And in the end, I will try to tie this all to vital normativity and what she could maybe bring to these discussions. So in the beginning, just a little reminder for every one of you that plants really dominate our Earth. Over 80% of our Earth biomass is made up of plants, and of course, without them, no animal, let alone any human, could even exist on this planet. But despite this, botany has really played, and still today plays, a very subordinate role within the life sciences. And also reasonings about plants are really underrepresented in natural philosophy and in the philosophy of biology. And maybe one of the reasons for this could be that plants pose some serious problems to the zoocentrically biased philosophy of biology. And there are some questions that philosophers and biologists have, they have tackled through history. One of them, are plants even alive? And natural philosophy has really discussed this question basically since antiquity. For example, Plato counted plants as living beings with the capacity for experience and desire, whereas Aristotle, on the other hand, ascribes to them the vegetative soul, so like the most basic kind of soul, but he sees them devoid of real life. So it doesn't really apply to them faculties of sensation or perception. And Christian and Jewish tradition, for example, also see plants as devoid of life and soul in comparison to animals. Linné, in his ordering of nature, posits plants between minerals and animals, but at least he characterizes them as not less alive than animals. So that's already something. Kant was a bit inconsistent in his consideration of plants, and sometimes he spoke of them as merely vegetating, meaning not living, but there are other passages where he characterizes them as alive, so apparently he didn't really settle on the matter. And still in the 90s, there were some philosophers who argued against plants really being alive because of the lack of perceivable intentionality in plants. I would say that today the discussion has rather shifted from this idea of vitality towards ideas of sentience, consciousness, intelligence. This is a really big discussion point in the philosophy of plants today, if these attributes can be put to plants. Are they sentient? Are they even intelligent? Or are they just intricate machines, so to say? And also a related question, of course, should they be the object of ethical consideration? And now turning a bit more to physiology and morphology, more distinctly, one argument for the vitality of plants has always been their growth. Because they grow, they are alive. And in this capacity of growing, plants really exceed animals. Because reaching maturity for plants doesn't mean that they stop growing, but as it is the case in most animals, but plants, or at least the perennial plants, never cease to grow and they keep on multiplying their cells. And this really makes sense because plants are sessile organisms, which means that they, if they want to explore new places, if they want to exploit new resources, if they want to broaden their horizons, so to say, they need to grow into these places. They cannot just walk there. In order to explore, they need to grow their roots into the new soils and their branches into the new territories. So growth and development really have to continue throughout their life cycle. so that plants can be able to adjust their body to fit to the changing circumstances that they encounter. And this is related to this idea of high phenotypic plasticity in plants, because as they grow into these new places, they really adapt their bodies accordingly. And depending on environmental influences and other factors, this means that plants of the same species can really assume radically different outward appearances, which also posed a problem to taxonomy for quite a while, because two individuals of the same species can really look radically different from one another depending on where they grow and what things they encountered in their life and which they had to react to through changing their bodies, basically. So this is another way how they adapt to their living conditions, which is very different from animals. And this is possible, this high phenotypic plasticity, because plants have a much larger percentage of totipotent cells in their body. So they have these meristematic cells that you can find all over a plant body, and that can just continually divide and give rise to new cells that then can differentiate into different kinds of tissue. And also, which is very fascinating, is that already differentiated cells can then, if need be, de-differentiate and then give rise to, for example, a new organ. So there's this possibility of re-embryonizing their cells, which gives them this high plasticity and this high capacity to react to their circumstances without having to run away from them. And another fascinating aspect of plant organization is the high autonomy that can be observed in some of their parts, which led to the characterization of many that plants are really more similar to colonies of individual organisms, for example, to insect colonies, so that there are philosophers that characterize like a tree, for example, as similar to a beehive, so that one tree doesn't correspond to one bee, but to the whole hive, because there is this high autonomy in the branches, in the twigs, in the roots. And this can, for example, be seen in the mechanism of grafting. So you can, this is often used in agriculture, for example, you can take a trunk from one species and then take a branch of another species and attach it by force mechanically to this trunk, and then they will, if everything works out and they are not completely distantly related, then they will connect their tissues and become one organism, so to say, but the branch that you attached will retain its characteristics. And one great example of this is the so-called tree of 40 fruits, which is one single tree that grows 40 different types of stone fruits. So there are peaches, plums, apricots, nectarines, cherries, almonds, and they are all brought together on this one trunk. There exist several individuals throughout in the world. They were all created by an artist who's called Sam van Eycken, and he initially conceived of this as an art project, but today this is for once also important for the preservation of old varieties, because he also has some old stone fruit varieties in these trees. But I also think that this is a fascinating illustration of the individuality of these tree branches, because they retain their characteristics. You have all these different types of flowers on this tree, the different timings of the flowering period and also the fruiting period. This is all retained in this one branch that is grafted on this tree. But on the other hand, of course, there are also many behaviors in plants that point towards plants really acting as one whole and as striving towards a common goal. So something like a mechanism of nutrient allocation within the plant, so that plants are able to allocate important elements, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, or nutrients within their body. So bring them from one place in the plant body to another in order to respond to external disturbances, for example, or also in processes like growth, reproduction, defense mechanisms. This is done, and this can really be seen as one integrated response of the whole plant to these external influences. Or another example would be hydraulic signaling, so that plants really can have that they have signals that they sense when the water pressure is too low in one part of the plant. Then the stomata, so the holes where the gas and the water exchange happens, will close so that water pressure doesn't drop any longer. And then the water will get distributed within the whole plant body to maintain overall plant health. And these mechanisms really depend on, first, long-distance signaling within the plant body, and then an integration of these signals to really perform an organized response. And as far as I have encountered them, most accounts that deal with teleology and agency in non-human organisms focus more on this side, so more on the integration and on goals that can be characterized as goals for the organism as a whole. But someone who developed a morphologically grounded theory that includes agency of plant parts is Agnes Arber with her partial shoot theory of the leaf. And just a bit biographical background on Agnes Arber. She was born in 1879, and she was born in London and lived there until she was 30 years old. Most of the time she lived in this house. As an Arber fan, I was very happy that I was able to visit it last year when I was in London. And then she moved to Cambridge in 1909, where she met Edward Alexander Newell Arber, who also worked as a scientist. He was a paleobotanist and geologist. And they also did some work together. They married, but then he died relatively young in 1918. They had one daughter, Muriel Agnes Arber, who was born in 1913 and who worked as a high school teacher and geologist. And for most of her professional career, Agnes Arber lived together with her daughter in Cambridge. She worked at the Balfour Biological Laboratory for Women in Cambridge University as a demonstrator and researcher in botany. But then these facilities got closed down. So she continued her work, but she worked from home. So she set up a laboratory at her home where she did her morphological research, and later she turned more to writing also about the philosophy of biology. This mode of work, of course, meant that she had no day-to-day contact with academia. She didn't really go to the university that often, but she herself said that she liked this mode of work because it made her very focused on her work, and it meant that she had to do all the tasks necessary for her work herself. So she also had to do the technical execution and also did illustrations of her work. And she continued to work until 1 year before her death in 1960. And during her scientific career, Arber published over 90 scientific papers and 7 books that you can see here. And she also published a translation of Goethe's Metamorphosis of Plants. And in general, Goethe and his work on plants was very important and a big influence on her. She wrote a lot about Goethe and discussed his morphology, and she can really be seen as standing in this tradition of romantic, informed biology, idealistic morphology that had its beginning with Goethe. And in her publications, you can also see her 3 main areas of interest in her work. Because her first book was a historical book about early herbals, and then she published morphological works on different plant groups, and later in life she worked more on broader questions pertaining to the philosophy of biology. So there was one book about the natural philosophy of plant form, in which she also puts forth this partial shoot theory of the leaf that I will talk about later. Then The Mind and the Eye, a very interesting and fascinating book for philosophers of biology, because it describes the biologist's standpoint and how the work of a biologist should or could be described throughout his scientific life, and what are the different stages that you have in your scientific career, so to say, including philosophical considerations of your whole biological work in the end of your life. And then her last book was about mysticism. This is a bit in a different direction. She characterized different mystics and wrote about the relation between the manifold and the one, so the multiplicity of forms in nature and the oneness on the other side. So this is more going in another direction than her morphological work earlier. But of course, these borders that I drew here are not that strict, and her interests also intermingle throughout her life. So she continued, for example, publishing papers about important figures from the history of botany, also later in her life. And her morphological works also contain already philosophical discussions. So this interest in philosophy developed earlier than this time where she then published these philosophical books. But I think this quite nicely illustrates her different research areas that she then combined to develop her really unique standpoint. And just one word about her illustrations, because Arber really was a very skilled draftsperson, and she illustrated most of her books and articles herself. Her father and her sister were painters, and she received art lessons from her father from the age of 3. And she really believed in the complementarity of science and art, and thought that this was especially important for biology in general and morphology in particular, which you can also see on these quotes here, where she says that there is indeed a certain correlation between artistic power and morphological insight, and artistic expression offers a mode of translation of sense data into thought without subjecting them to the narrowing influence of an inadequate verbal framework. So she was really convinced that drawing a plant can create special insights into its form and its structure, and that some of these insights can only be described and communicated through drawings and not through this inadequate verbal framework. So you really need this visual input to grasp certain ideas about form. So now I want to briefly introduce you to one of Arber's morphological theories, which is called the partial shoot theory of the leaf. And with this theory, Arber tackles a problem of plant morphology, namely, how do we conceptualize the composition of vascular plants' bodies? And about this problem, there are two competing models that discriminate or that describe the body. There's the so-called classical model, where you have 3 distinct parts of the plant. So you have the root, you have the stem, which is the central axis of the plant, and you have the leaf. So all lateral appendages are considered to belong to this leaf category, which means that they would be ultimately reducible to one basic leaf structure. But there is also a second model that has a long history, and this is the idea that stem and leaf together form a unit, which is called shoot. So this alternative model focuses on the unity of the shoot, whereas the classical model focuses more on the difference and the discreteness between stem and leaf. And Arber uses this alternative shoot model as the basis for her own model, but she integrates the idea of stem and leaf as discrete units to create a synthesis between these two already existing models. And this can really be seen as one common thread throughout Arber's work in general, that she tried to create synthesis between seemingly opposed views or models. And she does this through characterizing the leaf as a partial shoot. So for her, the leaf is not a basic category, but it is derived from the category of the shoot. And stem and leaf together form the whole shoot, whereas the leaf alone is only a partial shoot. And she draws inspiration for this theory from the history of botany, in which she was very well versed. And she points to the Swiss botanist Casimir de Candolle, who brought forth already this idea of the leaf as a partial shoot, even though he didn't use this term, partial shoot. This is an invention of Arber, but he already emphasized the relation between the parental shoot and the leaf, and Arber summarizes his position as saying the leaf is a partial shoot arising laterally from a parent whole shoot. And she uses this theory as a basis to formulate her own theory of the leaf. And her theory has at its core the idea that the leaf is a partial shoot, revealing an inherent urge towards becoming a whole shoot, but never actually attaining this goal, since radial symmetry and the capacity for apical growth suffer inhibition. This is quite a long sentence, so let me break it down. First, she says the leaf is a partial shoot. I already talked about this. For her, the leaf is no basic category, as it is in the classical model, but it is derived from the category of the shoot. Partial shoot also means the leaf is no whole shoot. It has deficits compared to the whole shoot. And this term partial, of course, also means that the leaf itself is a part of the thing called whole shoot. And then she goes on to say that the leaf has an inherent urge towards becoming a whole shoot. So here you really get a teleological notion and the idea that a part of an organism has a goal of its own. And this is a rather unusual notion when you talk about teleology in organisms. So where does she get the idea of this urge for completion from? Here she draws on philosophy, specifically on Spinoza, who says that everything has in itself a striving to preserve its condition and to improve itself. And Arber interprets this idea of Spinoza as an endeavor to strive for a condition of completeness or perfection, or framing it more in Aristotelian term, you could say that it wants to actualize existing potentialities. And this striving, Arber does not only attribute to the whole organism, but also to single organs like the leaf. So an improvement of itself for one leaf would mean to become more like a whole shoot. But the leaf never attains this goal, so it will never become a whole shoot because there are some characteristics that are inhibited, that are characteristic for the whole shoot, but that cannot come into completion in the partial shoot. So radial symmetry is inhibited, meaning a form of symmetry where you have many symmetry axes, as you can see on the bottom there. So this is the symmetry that can be seen in the whole shoot, but the leaf, or the typical leaf with its dorsiventral symmetry, doesn't have this symmetry anymore. And apical growth is inhibited, meaning growth from the tip. So the tip of the plant is called the apex, and the whole shoot grows continuously into this direction. It has this apical growth, but in the leaf, this soon dies down. So now you could ask, if these characteristics are not fulfilled in the leaf, where can you then see this urge? And there she has different strains of evidence that she puts forward. First, looking into early development, because in very early development, leaves begin to grow like shoots. So if you look at C here, there's really growth in length. So you have apical growth, and they also have radial symmetry. So the very, very embryotic first leaf has this radial symmetry, and she interprets this as meaning that even in the embryotic phase, the leaf shows an urge towards whole shoot characters. But this effort then soon dies down because these capacities are inhibited in the leaf. And another part of her evidence points to morphology, so she there looks at mature leaves and shoots and gives examples for leaves that approximate shoots in their structure and appearance. And this mainly appears in compound leaves. So just to give you some terms for this, on the one hand you have simple leaves which have one undivided plate, and then you can have compound leaves where the leaf has a fully subdivided plate. And then the parts of the leaf are called leaflets, and they are attached to the central axis, which is called rachis, sorry. And here you see a bipennately compound leaf on this side, and on the other side this is a shoot. So here you have a secondary axis, so the whole thing in itself is one leaf, and the leaflets would technically be called subleaflets because they're on the second branching of the leaf, so to say. This is not that important to get into the details, but as you can see, it's a very similar structure. So the one thing is a branched shoot, the other thing is a branched leaf, but she really shows that in these two, the corresponding elements really have the same structure and the same symmetry. And she, again, interprets this as an aspiration towards whole shoot characters that is more nuanced and more brought to the front in these compound leaves. And this really goes to the point that the small leaflets on this compound leaf fall from the rachis like the leaves of a tree fall from their branches. So yeah, she really points out these similarities. And then she also goes to reproduction and the phenomenon of leaf budding. So you have certain species where you can have small plantlets on the margins of the leaf, and they can develop into complete new plants. And she points out that it's not a new leaf that is on the margins, but it's a whole new shoot. So this is an indication of this latent whole shoot character in the leaf. And you find this phenomenon not only in these special species, but generally, if you make a leaf cutting, you can, in very many plants, with the appropriate cultural methods, bring this leaf cutting to develop new roots and a new shoot. So leaves in general have this latent power of shoot production. They cannot become shoots themselves, but they can give rise to them in the new generation. So having established this whole partial theory of the leaf, Arber then frames this as only one instance of a larger tendency that can be observed in the whole plant, namely the competition between parts in the plant. And she says that the likelihood will be increased that this postulated urge that she postulated in the partial shoot theory of the leaf has a real existence if it can be shown that there is, throughout the shoot complex and the root complex, a tendency for the members of each generation to compete with and attempt to dominate those of the previous generation. And she says that Goethe also already hinted at this tendency, and that there are really two conflicting tendencies in the plant body. You have, in some instances, the domination of the main axis versus the lateral axis, but you can also see in many forms the domination of the lateral axis. And this she sees as the expression of this attempt of the later generations to dominate the previous generation. And for this, she really gives a lot of examples from morphology and really from every level of plant organization to illustrate this trend for the dominance of lateral parts. I only give you two examples here. So on the left, there are many lateral axes that all overpower the middle axis in each generation. So like this here in the middle, this is the first generation, and it stops here. But then every following generation will grow longer, and in each branch, again, you see the same pattern, where the lateral axes are longer than the middle one. And this really goes down to, I think 6 branch structure, so to say. And on the other side, she shows the same tendency within the level of the leaf. So all these structures that you can see there are leaves in themselves, and within the leaf, the lateral parts are more developed, more nuanced, have more branches than the middle part. And even in the middle part, there you have again a branching into 3 parts, and then the lateral parts are again bigger and more branched than the middle part. So it really traces this down into every level on the plant to get to like small hairs in the end, where she shows the same tendency that she shows for the whole plant. Okay, this was a very intense look into morphology. I apologize, I hope you're still with me. And now I want to zoom out a bit and talk about the general issue of teleology in Arber's work, because her one notion of teleology can be seen in her partial shoot theory of the leaf. I say her one notion because my main aim of my project was to analyze Arber's view of teleology in the natural world, and it was kind of difficult because she seemed to contradict herself quite a lot. And I solved this issue, I think, through distinguishing 2 different notions of teleology that Arber shows in her work. So in most instances in which Arber explicitly talks about teleology, she expresses a notion of teleology that refers to Aristotle's final cause, so meaning the purpose or the end of a thing. And she herself defines the final cause as immanent in the organism, considered as a part of the whole. And I interpret this passage as meaning that the final cause acts on the organism embedded in its environment. So the whole would be organism plus environment. Meaning that then final teleology, which is the notion of teleology that draws on this understanding of the final cause, Final teleology ascribes functions to structures that relate to the environment of an organism, and it seeks the reason for adaptational changes in the environmental influences on the organism. So, for example, if you explain the flat and extensive surface of a leaf through its function as the place for photosynthesis and as an adaptation for maximizing energy output, this would be a final teleological explanation. And this notion of teleology, Arber herself is rather skeptical about, or at least cautious, because she finds it problematic to explain all forms with a supposed function. And this really put her outside of mainstream botanical thought at her time. But she was more interested in the other notion, which I call formal teleology, because it draws on Aristotle's formal cause. And this formal cause means the essence or essential nature of a thing, and she describes the formal cause as immanent in the organism, considered as a discrete individual. So I interpret this as meaning that the formal cause describes the essence of the organism, which initiates development according to the organism's innate nature. So not looking to the environment, but looking to the essence of the organism that initiates development. And this notion very much underlies her partial shoot theory of the leaf, because this theory makes assumptions about the intrinsic nature of the leaf. And the characterization of the leaf as a partial shoot is then an expression of the leaf's formal cause. But belonging to this is also this urge towards the development of whole shoot characteristics. And this is why I think that her understanding of the formal cause is teleological in its nature. Because the essence of the leaf does not only include its partial shoot character, it is also manifested in an endeavor to become more like something else and to actualize these existing potentialities. And I think that formal teleology also underlies Arber's morphology in general, as you can see, for example, in this quote where she says what is morphology all about. And she says that the business of morphology is to connect into one coherent whole all that may be held to belong to the intrinsic nature of a living being. And you could interpret this passage as meaning that the business of morphology, in the end, is to spell out the formal cause of a living being. So after this characterization of her teleological views, I want to briefly try to connect this to ideas of vital normativity. I'm really new to this whole topic, so I'm very interested in input on this, if you think that this makes sense, if I have the wrong impression of vital normativity. But I think that Arber and her notion of formal teleology could maybe bring something very interesting into this discussion, namely another factor, because what I have read on vital normativity, these accounts mostly focus on the necessity for organisms to stay alive. So this is like the basic norm that everything else is then built on. So this is the basic premise, and then you can put different norms on top of this, but you always have this need of the organism to stay alive. But Arber, from the beginning, goes one step further, because she views this actualization of potentiality and the improvement of an organism's form as another goal that living beings strive for. And she shows the outcomes of this striving in her morphological evidence that she puts forward. And with her partial shoot theory of the leaf, she also points to, I think, very important tensions between the part and the whole, especially in plants. And she shows that parts can be in competition with each other, as I showed previously, and that they can strive for the actualization of different goals. So depending on which part of the plant you're looking at, you maybe have different goals. And this, I think that this aspect of this high autonomy of parts is missing in large part of the discussions around organismality and teleology in organisms. And it also opens up the question if maybe partially different norms should be assumed when talking about plant parts versus plant whole. So this is the one part, but I also want to point out that despite Arber's underlining of this possibility of agency and autonomy in plant parts, she was also very much arguing for looking at the organism in totality. So she had really this holistic notion of the organism, and she sees the organismal approach as the desirable synthesis between mechanism and vitalism. So for her, it is completely legitimate to look at parts and to analyze and to go to very tiny levels into the plant, but in the end you have to bring it back to the whole organism. You can't leave out this step of reintegrating your insights that you got from looking at only the parts. And so Arber really argues for this inclusion of teleological thinking into biology and against a solely mechanistic approach to the natural world. So this is again this tendency of bringing together apparently opposed views. She's not against mechanistic views. She thinks that they are very valuable, but they have to be integrated with teleological reasonings in biology as well. So these are just some of the reasons why I think that Arber's philosophy of biology can be inspiring for discussions about normativity and teleology today, and I'm very open to input and questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Beautiful story. I didn't know about her, and almost too perfect. It's like this person existed and stuff. But the question, simple question, and it's very gendered, is what about Darcy Thompson? Because not so much specifically on the plant side, but on much of the general theoretical side, including the Goethean dimension and the kind of morphological holism and stuff, it sounds rather like, it's been a while since I've read him, but it sounds rather like Darcy Thompson, who possibly, given the dates and England, was an influence or a friend or something. So, the rude version is like, so why is this different from Darcy Thompson? Obviously, there's a whole area difference, but also the biographical question, like, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, there was definitely an influence and a friendship because they had a long-standing correspondence. And I'm right now working on transcribing this, so there's a lot there, I think. I need to get more into the Thompson side to really understand like their tensions and also the things where they have the same opinion, because there's one author who says that in the beginning they write a lot about morphology, and she also comments on his papers and vice versa, and later in life they write more about like what your day looks like or the war and so stuff that's going on in your life, and this author says that this was because they differed in their morphological interpretations and they couldn't find a common ground in this. But I think that at least in the beginning there was a very big influence of Thompson on her, and she also wrote that she hopes that someone could do the same thing that Thompson did for zoology for botany. So she saw this gap and she hoped that somebody could maybe fill it. And he also asked her to do an illustration for one of his books. So there's definitely a relationship.
Yeah, thank you. Hello?
I was just wondering, because at the symposium that Straetmanns mentioned was kind of a prequel to this conference, I had a talk about Michael Levin, who works on like developmental biology but in animals, and I found it interesting that like he had this idea that the part of the organization of like reaching a common goal in animals is instantiated in the physiological network, and so if you disrupt the network, you get like parts of the cells that are like not connected to the network start having their own pursuit of their goals, and usually this results in cancer, for instance. So I was just like wondering, like, do you know, like, because you could interpret that in class that basically this second order integration is not yet present as much because you have all of these autonomous parts that are, trying to compete actually for dominance, whereas at least in like later animals, it's more constrained towards, and that's why also like most plants lose their ability to like regenerate as like that, because they're more specialized and more subordinated to the whole in this way.
Yeah, and this would be like a evolutionary hierarchical idea that this is like a higher level of integration, so to say.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just like making a comment.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I need to think about this. I only know that I attended a talk of Michael Levin, and he said that they want to work on plants in the future. So apparently he has this idea and wants to look at it as well. But this is, yeah, it's really interesting that there is also this beginning of autonomy if you detach cells or parts of animal organisms, and maybe that this is maybe the same thing that is also happening in plants.
Because I know you have even in plants you have like, I mean, you said before that it still like acts as a whole, you know, like the parts of the nutrients travel to different parts and stuff like that. But I mean, I'm not so well versed in plant physiology. Is it like only locally coordinated, this sort of like, you know, interaction, or is there like some sort of maybe this sort of network that is not, you know, a nervous system just yet, but it's like some sort of coordinated activity on the level of the whole plant, we maybe know?
I think we're still in the stage where we don't really know this. So the picture that I showed for this integration thing was from a paper where they looked at what signal molecules flow through the xylem and the phloem, and if they could be the things that make this integration work. And there's a lot of research about this, and there are also philosophical opinions about this, but I think that right now we don't really know exactly how this integration really works, and if it's like homological to animal organization, or if it's completely a different way of doing this with just getting the same output in the end. So yeah, it's a very fascinating topic. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, now you're Moritz.
Yeah, so thanks, that was fantastic. I didn't even know about her. Don't know why. This reminded me of a discussion in the late 2010s at the KLI. A mutual acquaintance of Arancha's and mine said, I have a theory of the organism of plants are not organisms. And I said, well, then there surely is something wrong with your theory of the organism, not the plant. So it's still alive, this discussion. It's very funny. I have a question about final and formal teleology, because one central point of Robert Rosen's work is to show that the final cause is just the totality of the formal and efficient cause in an autopoietic or a system that is close to efficient causation. It's causing itself. That is the point of autopoiesis, what Rosen calls closure to efficient causation, but is really including formal causation. Something that Janni Hofmeier, we'll talk about this tomorrow, showed recently. So so Rosen's idea of the efficient causation is a bit wrong, or Aristotelians get very upset about it. But so because it mixes up formal and efficient cause. But the totality, the formal cause is kind of the shape of the efficient causes. You can think about the genetic code instructing what kind of proteins you have active in the cell, and the totality of that is making the cell itself. So this unifies the final and the formal teleology concepts, I think, that you just presented, because the formal teleology concept is just a demystified Aristotelian final cause. It's just basically a kind of circular causality. We'll also talk about this tomorrow, which is really interesting, so we should discuss this later on. I was just really thinking about this, because what we're talking about when we talk about the organism, it's a process, first of all. It's not a thing, although we always have these static representations. And that process is manufacturing itself. And in such a process, final cause and the totality of formal and efficient causes coincide. So in the end, it is the same, but it's funny because it's interesting that she liked the second better, because it's kind of an explanation of the rather mystical concept of Aristotelian final causation. And I'm really sort of skeptical often about resurrecting Aristotelian final causation without explanation, naturalistic explanation, which happens sometimes in the ecological account of Dennis Walsh and people like that, I think. So it has to be the other way around. We first have to explain how this is actually happening, and it's happening because organisms, including plants which are alive and which are organisms, have this particular circular hierarchical causal structure. So I guess that wasn't the question, something that inspired me when you were talking before. So great talk, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. That's also a lot to think about for me. The only thing that I thought was that maybe Arber also overlooked this relation between the formal cause and the efficient cause, and I really need to look into this, what this means, because she draws a very clear distinction between like efficient and material cause on the one hand, these are the mechanical causes, and the formal and the final cause are the teleological causes. And she never tries, I mean, in the end she says, okay, we need to bring mechanism and teleology back together, but this is like the whole enterprise to bring everything and have the synthesis in the end. But she really has this distinction, so it's interesting to think about the relation between efficient and formal causes.
So I really recommend Yanni Hofmeier's recent work.
Yeah.
It's very formalistic in the sense of category theory and Rosen, and people hate this kind of stuff. But it's really interesting if you're willing to suffer.
Thanks.
Just a short add-on. Like I was going in the same direction with my question about the final teleology and formal teleology aspect of the theorizing, and I was just like immediately thinking of the concept that Donna Haraway uses a lot, like synpoiesis, and like if there's this tension between like synpoiesis and autopoiesis, that it could be like translated in like the contemporary language of what you call the tension between the part-whole relation.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I should look into this because I'm looking for ways in which her ideas could be framed in like modern language and what she means and how would we describe this today. So yeah, that's a good.
I think that's kind of interesting because like when Yogi also said it's kind of like the demystified version. This is like usually what autopoietic people think about synpoiesis, that like autopoiesis has everything already, so it doesn't add anything new. But I think there is a lot of discussion to be had. Co-construction of several individuals can add something to the data.
Okay, yes.
Thank you. Very nice talk. I knew of Agnes Arber because Hanson in Paths of Discovery mentions her, the thing about the TI and Getty, I don't know if you remember. But, and then I looked at what she had done, and I read, and I thought of working on her, but I never did, so I really don't know a lot. But what you have been explaining about the formal teleology has brought to mind Goodwin's work on the Brian Goodwin, the structuralist biologist, who also had a plant diagnosis as a model organism, and he has a very rational view with the golden rule to explain the Bauplan. Do you think that the formal teleology, that what Agnes Arber is thinking is something like what zoologists perhaps, or even called the Bauplan or the archetype or something like that?
Yes, I think that's definitely related, but she also had a problem with this type concept that was around in like the more idealistic morphology in Germany basically at the time. So she talks a lot about Wilhelm Troll, who had this type idea that then again came from Goethe in the beginning, and she works from this, like the basic hypothesis that there is this type of the leaf, for example, and this is good as a working hypothesis, but then this is too static for her to just think about these archetypes as like static features or static Bauplans, so to say.
Yeah, the archetype, the idea of the archetype is that it's going to be generative. So in a way, Goodwin always explains these Bauplans or his ideas as generative.
Okay, so there's this processual dimension in it. Okay, and then it's maybe more on her side. I would have to look into this to estimate this, but yeah, thanks for the input.
Ja,
very captivated by this idea that art can be a productive part of the methodology of studying biological phenomena. Because I imagine that biologists today don't really draw plants all that much as they used to.
Yeah.
But I think this mode of the way how you observe things could actually be helpful, or at least determine the way you're actually going to put the things apart or together. For example, if you look at art, I think it's a kind of activity which constantly looks at this relation between the part and the whole. And this might attune you in a certain sense to this relationship in the organism itself. And at the same time, it's kind of a teleological activity. It's always very goal-driven. And for example, I can imagine myself, if you're drawing a plant out, you're kind of trying to attune yourself to the purposiveness of its parts in a certain sense. And so this might shape the way you're going to think about the plant, as opposed to, for example, putting a cell under a microscope or something and just being really focused on the parts and losing sight of the whole. So I think that's a very interesting point, and I'm not sure this is really a part of modern science, and maybe it should be kind of as a kind of a stimulant that might open us to new avenues of thinking. And maybe just to turn this into more of a question, if you have anything to expand, or perhaps the book I should read to read more about that.
Then I would definitely refer to The Mind and the Eye. So this is the penultimate book where I said that it's about the biologist's standpoint, but it's much more than that, even though it's not that long, so it's a short read. But there she also, in this last part, so she has like 6 parts of the life of a biologist, so to say, and of her research, and the 6th part is the philosophical consideration, and like half of the book is about this part, because she also is basically towards the end of her life at this point, and she also reflects on her own work. And there she also dives into this relationship between art and science, and specifically drawing and morphology, and what this means that you understand things about a plant better if you draw it. And I mean, this relationship goes both ways. You also have to understand something about the plant in order to be able to draw it in a certain way, I think. So it depends really on each other. But yeah, she comes in the end to this conclusion that we need the synthesis again of the mind and the eye. So the drawing, the seeing, and the thinking about it. And if you're interested in this, I would definitely recommend this book.
Because maybe this would be kind of interesting from an Aristotelian perspective, where we have the theory of art, where art is kind of trying to put the universal through the concrete and so forth. And here science is more focused on the universal, and now here we have this intertwined relationship that both trying to put the universal into the concrete and vice versa might open up new avenues of thinking about each of these.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
Maybe just to piggyback on that, Daston's essay on glass flowers is entirely about this, you know. There is this weird set of objects in Harvard Museum of Natural History called glass flowers, done by these Czech father and son genius weirdos from the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, who made, but it's a room like 3 times the size of this one, filled with these scientific objects, which became scientifically useless quite fairly quickly, and so they're art objects, but then Daston wrote a whole essay on exactly this thing. I think it's called the glass flower.
Where is it? In Natural Museum?
The objects themselves?
Yeah.
Harvard Museum of Natural History. I saw it 10, 15 years ago, and it was old and dusty, and now it's like they spend a lot of money making it nicer.
So there's an artist called Gemma Anderson. She just published she spent her whole life doing this research about drawing and its role in epistemology, and she's just published a book, and I forgot the title, which is really embarrassing because I have a chapter with her in that book. And if you Google Jaeger and Anderson, it's the most useless Google because it's the most common name. So I can give you the specific.
Drawing is a way
That was
of,
very helpful.
Drawing.
as a way of knowing.
Yes, thank you. So she is really brilliant. She's worked with John Dupre, and she's just, it's fresh out like this year.
remembered also from, I also read an article from Dastan, but not this one, but Georgias, she talks about like not, that we should, in science, not only talk about seeing bad and seeing as, but also seeing well, and this seeing well is connected to like aesthetic seeing.
But if I'm not mistaken, and then we wrap this up, basically this fascination occurs with drawing, goes basically back to Goethe, which is precisely this idea that if you want to understand a phenomenon, you have to think with it, which means basically being able to grasp the prototype. The prototype is something that is mentioned that is unfolding, and you cannot basically capture it just like some, static conceptual whole. What you can do, you can capture it in its movement, and then through the drawing of it, you basically can, in a certain sense, enter into that type of scene that he's talking about. Just mentioning this because the storm, they go in a different direction. They are relevant with regards to this, but I would assume that given what we've heard, it's more related to the Goethean tradition, where you learn how to think with the phenomenon. Okay, thank you very much again. So we have one more last talk for today.